Hello again. Today we're going to continue kind of the road to the revolution. If you want to follow along, this is the Townshend Acts to the Tea Party slideshow, or Townshend Acts to the Coercive Acts. They're the same slideshow, so just click on the one that says one of those. So a little bit more today, but I'm going to try to speed through it, keep it under 20 minutes. We left off last time, the Stamp Acts were repealed, so the colonists think they win, but Parliament says, hold on, we can still tax you when we want to. Charles Townshend passes a series of taxes called the Townshend Duties or the Townshend Acts in 1767. He basically says, these are external taxes. I'll tax the stuff before it gets to America. That way they won't really feel like they're paying the actual tax. It'll be incorporated into the price of stuff before it gets to the colonies. The colonists aren't fooled by this. They still see it as a tax. The Townshend Acts tax things such as glass, silk, paper, paint, tea, other things that the American colonists imported. And this money was going to go to administer the government of the colonies, but they saw it as, we're not represented in Parliament, so you guys shouldn't be taxing us. It also moved some of those vice admiralty courts to America, so like Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston. So these court systems that the Americans really hate, now they're on American soil. They don't really like that. Benjamin Franklin realizes a change in things in England. He basically says, every man in England seems to consider himself a piece of the sovereign over America. Seems to jostle himself into the throne with the king and talk of our subjects in the colony. So he says a lot of Englishmen are starting to say, like, those wily Americans, they're kind of, what are we going to do about them? John Dickinson, who I really like John Dickinson. He writes a whole bunch of essays, letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. He is probably the greatest thinker, or one of them, as far as like defending the constitutional right of the colonists. He actually later on will be against declaring independence. He's pro sticking up for the colonies' rights. He doesn't like what Great Britain is doing. He just doesn't think we should declare our independence. So after he opposes the Declaration of Independence, a lot of people kind of say like, your reputation's going downhill, even though he did stick up for American rights. If you look at slide 7, I'll let you read his quote, but he does stick up for American rights. The Townshend Acts also did something. There was a provision called the Quartering Act. It was in 1765, so sorry, this is an earlier law, so typo there. But basically it said a lot of the British soldiers were in New York, and it said, New York, you have to basically house them or at least provide for them to stay somewhere. The New York Assembly refuses to tax the colonies to pay for these soldiers. So basically, New York, their assembly gets suspended. So now you have the British basically suspending self-government in America on a small scale. They don't like this. Sam Adams writes something called a circular letter, a letter that basically goes to all the other colonies. The British tell the governors of the 13 colonies, you have to condemn this letter. Don't let your state governments stand in solidarity with New York or with what Sam Adams said. But Massachusetts says, nope, we're going to stand up for New York, and we're going to stand up for what Sam Adams has to say in a circular letter. So the colonists are getting more of an opposition built. The British send warships into Boston Harbor. The warship Romney is sent there. General Thomas Gage, he's kind of the British commander in America. He's in New York, but he's later on in 1774, he's going to go to Boston. Look at slide 14. There's a pretty good George Washington quote. George Washington's kind of quiet during this time, but he does start to say, like, we can't give in to these British taxes. Where will it end? This guy, Frederick Lord North, he becomes prime minister. He's a friend of King George III. He's prime minister for the rest of the kind of class during the war, so he's the official kind of in charge. He tries to enforce the Townshend Acts. Back in Boston, John Hancock is the richest guy in Boston. He's a smuggler. His ship, the Liberty, smuggles wine from all over the place. It gets confiscated by the British. This is called the Liberty Incident or the Liberty Affair. You can kind of read about that, but the British officials are confiscating American property. There's some impressment of sailors. The British, when their ship lost a person, if they needed somebody to fill his role, they might just go to a port and go to a tavern and just arrest somebody and say, "You're now a new sailor. Welcome aboard. We're going to force you to serve." They did this in Boston. They went there and they tried to force people to sail on a British ship. There's some tense words, and the captain of the Romney threatens to shoot cannon into the city of Boston. Cooler heads prevailed, and nothing happened in this time. Eventually, British troops get sent to Boston. I'm on slide 22. 1,500 troops land in 1768. One of the reasons they get called lobsterbacks is because British discipline was so harsh. If you stole or disobeyed orders as a British soldier, you could get 500 lashes. So your back would be really bloody. So that's one reason they get called lobsterbacks. It's not just because their uniforms are red. There is some fighting. There's this little thing called the Battle of Golden Hill. Basically, some British soldiers tear down a liberty pole. The colonists would just erect a pole out in the middle of the commons and call it a liberty pole. The British would tear it down. The colonists would put it back up, and basically they would put it up, tear it down, put it up, and tear it down. So there's physical violence. There's a young boy, Christopher Cider. He ends up basically taunting or kind of harassing a guy who won't boycott British goods. This guy accidentally shoots Christopher Cider and kills him. So this is the big incident in Boston. A kid, he's not even a teenager yet, gets killed by this British sympathizer. So Boston's kind of up in arms about this. Phyllis Wheatley, who's kind of a famous poet from this era, she wrote a poem. There's a line that says, "In heaven's eternal court it was decreed, how the first martyr for the cause should bleed." There's other riots in America. A lot of the British soldiers that came here didn't have good jobs, so they would work part-time jobs. So they would compete with colonists, Americans, for jobs. There's all kinds of fights that happen because of that. You can kind of look at the slides. Eventually, the Townshend Acts get repealed, but the day they get repealed is when the Boston Massacre happens. If you look at slide 30, that's kind of Paul Revere's representation of it. I'm not going to talk much about the Boston Massacre. You can read the slides, and the Robert Leckie book actually goes into a lot of detail. Basically, the colonists were harassing British soldiers. There's, one British soldier and then, around a dozen British soldiers. And there's hundreds of people in the American mob, and they throw stuff at the soldiers, and muskets go off. 5 guys get killed. But this is a huge incident. This is the first, big violent event, I guess you could say, that's happened because of the conflict growing. So you can kind of read about that. If you look at I'm clicking on it. If you look at slide 43, there's a link. There's some Discovery Channel show. They're actually a crime show. I don't remember the name of it, but they did a reenactment of the Boston Massacre. They're kind of like a CSI show, and they reenact crime scenes to try to figure out what happened. They do a reenactment. It's kind of corny, but it's something. It at least gives you a visual. So if you want to just type that in your browser, you can kind of see how it may have went down. John Adams defends the British soldiers during their court hearing. Long story made short, nobody's found. 2 guys are found guilty of manslaughter. They get branded. They don't get put to death. Nobody gets put to death. Getting branded is kind of a slap on the wrist. You can kind of read some bio about John Adams there. After the Boston Massacre, people start to realize, whoa, things got out of hand. There was gunfire. People got killed. Let's calm down a little bit. So 1770 to 1773 is kind of calm. There is something called the Gaspee Affair. Basically, the governor and the sheriff of Rhode Island are very pro, like, opposing the British. They basically tell the Royal Navy, like, we'll arrest you if you come looking for smugglers. There's an incident where a British ship gets burned. There's some gunfire. The British captain of the ship gets shot and almost dies. You can kind of read about that. But for 1770 to 1773, it's not, everybody kind of calms down, cooler heads prevail. One other thing that changes, I'm on slide 73. In June 1772, Governor Hutchinson, the guy whose house got destroyed, he's now governor, he announces that royal officials won't be paid by the colony anymore. Now think about this. Whoever controls the money kind of controls the power. If you're the colonial assembly and you pay the governor, you can actually withhold his payment if he does something you don't like. And this happened all the time in the 13 colonies. You know, most colonies had a pro-British governor, but like a pro-colonial legislature. So if the royal governor does something that Parliament wants but that the colonists don't like, the colonial assembly just says, well, we're not going to pay you until you maybe give in to us. A lot of royal governors gave in to the colonial assemblies because they wanted to get paid. Well, now if Parliament, if the British are paying your salary, there's no more pressure on you by the colonial assembly. You can side with the British and still get your paycheck. So the colonists want to pay the bills for the royal governor because that means they have checks and balances on the governor. One thing that starts are these things called committees of correspondence. They start in Boston or in Massachusetts, and they basically spread. But basically, think about this. There's no telephones or email. It's hard to communicate. Basically, the committee of correspondence is, let's set up these groups in all these colonies, and we'll write letters back to each other. That way, we're all on the same page. Hey, are you a rebel, a patriot in Boston? You can write to rebels and patriots in, Philadelphia who oppose the British, and you guys can all be on the same page. It's basically 18th century networking. That's kind of what goes on, but they're pretty important in starting a movement of opposition. Benjamin Franklin gets a hold of some private letters of Thomas Hutchinson. This causes him problems later on. But basically, Governor Hutchinson says, look, if we have to give up a little bit of liberty, a little bit of our English liberties in order to have the blessings of the British Empire, I'm okay with that. Well, Benjamin Franklin is like, I've got you. You said you wanted to give up English liberties. We colonials are not okay with that. So that'll come back to bite Benjamin Franklin in the rear end later on. What happens in 1773 is the British decide to put a tax on tea. And basically it's also a tax decrease, but it's just meant to keep the tax. There's two taxes on tea. The British East India Company brings tea from India to England and then from England to the colonies. The tea gets taxed in England and then it gets taxed in America. The King and Parliament say, we're not going to make you pay the tax in England, but we will make the tax get paid in America. So tea actually drops in price, but it's still that idea of we're going to tax you. This also doesn't fool the colonists. It leads to the Boston Tea Party in December 1773. A whole bunch of colonists dress up as Indians. They go out on the British ships. There's all these tea ships in the harbor, and they tear open the wooden chests and they throw the tea into the harbor. And tea ships go to Charleston, New York City, Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia. They all get turned away. So all this tea coming to America never gets unloaded because the colonists either boycott it and don't let it come off the ships, or in the case of Boston, they throw it in the harbor and have a big party. Well, what ends up happening is the British decide we have to punish the colonists for this. Now, in January of 1774, Franklin gets called before the Privy Council. These are kind of like the king's advisors, and he's on some business for Massachusetts, but he ends up getting just yelled at by Alexander Wedderburn. He's the kind of chief prosecutor on the Privy Council. Basically, you can kind of see the picture or the painting there. Benjamin Franklin is in this room with all these officials, and he's getting yelled at by the British prosecutor and basically getting called all kinds of names. He's called you're not a gentleman, all this stuff. It really makes Benjamin Franklin mad. He ends up supposedly saying when he walked out of the room, "I'll make your master a little king for this." A lot of historians, if you look at Benjamin Franklin before this, he's for compromise. He doesn't want Parliament to tax the colonies, but he also doesn't want the colonies to get rowdy. After this, he's pretty much like, we've got to go our own way. We've got to separate with England. Here, look at slide 97. This is what the British do. They pass the Coercive Acts. It's a series of laws meant to punish Boston and Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Port Act closes the port of Boston. Boston is a port city. Now their livelihood is shut off. The Massachusetts Government Act basically cancels self-government in Massachusetts. The Administration of Justice Act, if you're a British soldier and you beat an American colonist or accidentally shoot them, like at the Boston Massacre, you go on trial in America and you'll probably be found guilty, maybe, because the colonists are really angry. Well, the Administration of Justice Act says, no, you're not going to be tried in America. If you're a soldier and you do something illegal, we'll bring you back to England and we'll try you here. Well, if you're a soldier and you smack somebody with the butt of your rifle and you get charged with assault, you go back to England, they'll probably, have a trial and declare you innocent, and they'll probably pat you on the back and say next time hit a couple more colonists, for us. So the colonists don't like this. The Quartering Act just basically said you have to house soldiers in your homes. The Quebec Act basically took some territory in Canada and extended it down into the colonies. If you look at slide 101, you can see how the dark blue, that's Quebec, the province of Quebec, but the Quebec Act actually extended it down. So, it's bumping up against colonial Virginia's claims to land. Thomas Gage arrives in Boston in 1774 as the military governor. So now self-government is totally out the window. You have a military governor in the state. Thomas Gage called for taking a hard line against the colonists. He told the king, hey, as long as the colonists are lions and if we act like lambs, they're going to keep causing problems. The minute we put our fist down and say no more and we get tough with them, the colonists are going to stop this foolishness. And King George III is like, oh, that's good advice. Take a hard line. He pretty much always took the advice that was the harshest towards the colonists. He comes to Massachusetts and enforces the Coercive Acts. The other colonies send food and money to Massachusetts. Basically, the other colonies feel like Massachusetts is being unfairly punished, so we got to stick up for them. Virginia calls for a day of prayer and fasting to ask God to deliver us from the evils of civil wars, they call it. Their colonial assembly gets dissolved because they're showing solidarity with Massachusetts. So basically, the British are taxing the colonies, and the colonies are upset, but now the British are canceling self-government in the colonies. So it's not just taxation. Your government, your right to self-government is actually being taken away. Go to the last slide, slide 118. I'm not going to go into too much of the government during the Revolutionary War, but basically there's a national congress that meet starting in 1774. This is called the First Continental Congress. They meet again in 1775. This is the Second Continental Congress. And then later on, they're called the Confederation Congress. They're basically the national congress for the 13 colonies. They meet during the Revolutionary War, and they kind of guide war policy. So this is the national government for the 13 colonies. They're governed by the Articles of Confederation. I kind of wrote some information down on that slide. But that's the government. that's functioning. So they meet in Philadelphia. Each state sends its delegates. You know, Pennsylvania sends like 7 or 9. Rhode Island might send 2 or 3. Here's the important thing. Each delegation that goes to Philadelphia represents a state. So each state gets 1 vote in Congress. So there's 13 possible votes in Congress. So let's say they're going to vote on something important. Should we declare war? They don't actually declare war necessarily the way we think of it today, but should we declare war? They'll talk about it. Pennsylvania's 7 guys will go in the corner and they'll talk, and 4 of them will say yes and 3 of them will say no. So when they all reconvene, you know, the speaker or the president of the Congress says, how does Pennsylvania vote? And Pennsylvania says, we cast our 1 vote for war or for the Declaration of Independence. You know, there's some cases where, like, Delaware has 2 delegates and they're split and they can't decide. 1 votes yes, 1 votes no. Well, then the president of the Congress will say, how does Delaware vote? Delaware will say, we can't make up our mind, we're split, so we don't vote. But that's a little bit how the government works. We'll read the Articles of Confederation later on, and some of the readings and discussion and videos will kind of talk about them. But that's the last video I'm going to make. The rest of the stuff will be discussion board, the documentaries, the reading, and any questions we kind of talk through in the virtual classroom. So if you have any questions, be sure to let me know. But other than that, we'll keep learning.